At 55, Richard Rawlings, the fast-talking, car-loving star of Fast and Loud, seems to have it all. A multi-million-dollar empire, fame that stretches across the globe, and a reputation as one of TV's most charismatic automotive personalities. But behind the scenes, the man who once lived life in the fast lane has faced heartbreaks that no amount of horsepower could outrun. Fans remember him as the unstoppable force behind Gas Monkey Garage, a place where rusted relics turned into roaring masterpieces. But as his fame skyrocketed, so did the pressures, betrayals, and personal losses that would quietly consume him. The smiling, confident businessman we saw on screen began to fade, replaced by a man fighting to hold together the pieces of a life he built from nothing. Richard's story is not just about fast cars and flashy success. It's about the steep emotional toll that comes when ambition collides with reality. His relationships crumbled under the strain of fame. His business, once a thriving empire, faced internal conflicts and financial uncertainty. And his health, both physical and emotional, began to suffer from years of stress, sleepless nights, and public scrutiny. In a world that celebrated his every success, few noticed the growing pain behind his trademark grin. But as Richard Rawlings approaches a new chapter in his life, he's finally opening up about the truth behind the cameras and the personal tragedies that nearly broke him completely. What really happened to Richard Rawlings? How did one of reality TV's biggest stars fall into such darkness? This is the story of his rise, fall, and heartbreaking fight to find peace once again, before the fame, before the cameras, and long before the world came to know him as the brash, energetic face of Fast and Loud. Richard Rawlings was just a Texas kid with a dream. Born in Fort Worth in 1969, Richard's earliest memories revolved around the smell of motor oil, the sound of engines revving, and the sight of his father tinkering beneath the hood of an old car. For him, those weren't just moments of curiosity, they were lessons that shaped his entire life. Richard often said that cars were his first love. By the time he was a teenager, he was already buying and selling vehicles, not because he had money to spare, but because he had a relentless drive to turn passion into opportunity. He worked odd jobs, saved every penny he could, and spent countless nights in dusty garages learning everything about engines, restoration, and the art of making something valuable out of the forgotten. Before his big break, Richard's path was anything but easy. He became a firefighter, a police officer, and even worked as a paramedic, all while chasing his automotive dreams on the side. Those years were marked by long shifts, sleepless nights, and the struggle of balancing survival with ambition. Yet through it all, he never let go of his belief that one day, his passion for cars would change his life. In 2002, that belief became reality when he founded Gas Monkey Garage. What started as a modest workshop in Dallas quickly evolved into a cultural phenomenon. The shop became a temple for car lovers, a place where forgotten vehicles were reborn with power, precision, and style. Richard's sharp eye for design, business instincts, and unfiltered charisma soon caught the attention of television producers. In 2012, Fast and Loud premiered on the Discovery Channel, catapulting Richard into stardom. The show's mix of car restoration, humor, and high-stakes deals turned him into a household name. Audiences were drawn to his energy, his quick wit, his fearless approach to business, and his genuine love for every project that rolled into the garage. Within a few short years, Richard had gone from small-town mechanic to international celebrity, but as success grew, so did the demands. The show's popularity meant longer filming hours, tighter schedules, and immense pressure to keep delivering bigger, better builds. The fame that once felt like validation began to feel like a weight. Behind the roaring engines and flashy edits, Richard was running on fumes. The very dream he had worked his entire life to achieve was slowly consuming him. Yet, at that time, few noticed the cracks forming beneath the surface. The world saw the confident businessman, the man with the fast cars, the fame, and the fortune. But Richard knew that success often comes at a cost. And for him, that cost would soon reveal itself in ways far more painful than he ever imagined. His story, once defined by ambition and adrenaline, was about to take a darker turn, one that would test his resilience, his relationships, and his faith in everything he'd built. At the height of his success, Richard Rawlings seemed untouchable. With Fast and Loud ruling the airwaves and Gas Monkey Garage booming, his name became synonymous with energy, charm, and ambition. He had the cars, the fame, the money, and a global fan base cheering him on. But behind that confident grin, his personal life was quietly falling apart, and the weight of his growing fame began to take a heartbreaking toll. Richard's first marriage to Karen K. Grames had ended years before the world ever knew his name. It was brief but painful, a reminder of how difficult it was to balance love with his obsession for work. He later found love again with Katerina Deason, a woman who shared his drive and sense of adventure. Their relationship was fiery and passionate, the kind that seemed built to last. But fame has a cruel way of testing even the strongest bonds. As Fast and Loud exploded in popularity, Richard's life turned into a non-stop cycle of filming, business deals, and travel. Every day was about deadlines, sponsors, and expectations. The fame that once felt like a blessing became a wall between him and the people he loved most. "You start chasing success so hard," Richard once admitted, "that you forget why you started in the first place." The more successful he became, the more isolated he felt. Arguments grew frequent, time together became rare, and soon the emotional distance became impossible to ignore. His marriage began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny and exhaustion. By the time fans noticed something was wrong, it was already too late. The divorce hit Richard hard, and though he remained composed in public, those close to him said he was devastated behind closed doors. For a man who lived by the motto, blood, sweat, and beers, the heartbreak was something he couldn't fix with humor or hard work. He had faced financial failure before, but emotional loss was different. It lingered, gnawed at him, and made him question everything he thought he wanted. The cars, the fame, the fortune, none of it mattered when the garage lights went out and he went home alone. And yet, Richard being Richard, he tried to push through. He buried himself deeper into work, hoping that success could fill the void. He launched new ventures, expanded Gas Monkey into a global brand, and signed new deals. But the faster he ran, the more he lost control. What once brought him joy now only reminded him of what it cost him to get there. By his mid-50s, Richard had the world at his feet but loneliness in his heart. The man who once inspired millions to chase their dreams was now struggling to hold on to his own. And as the cameras continued to roll, capturing every smile and every fans had no idea that behind the scenes, the fast life he built was starting to crash, piece by piece. The tragedy wasn't just that Richard lost love. It was that fame, the very thing he worked his entire life for, became the reason he lost himself. And as he would later admit, you can rebuild cars, but rebuilding trust, love, and peace of mind, that's the real challenge. As Fast and Loud dominated television ratings, viewers saw only the triumphs, the million-dollar builds, the wild auctions, the laughter that echoed through Gas Monkey Garage. But when the cameras stopped rolling, Richard Rawlings faced a far more complicated reality. The success that had once fueled him was now draining every ounce of his energy. For years, the pace was relentless. Between filming schedules, business expansions, car shows, and public appearances, Richard barely had time to breathe. The man who had built his empire with his own hands was now running it through exhaustion. He'd wake up before dawn, spend long days filming under hot lights, and stay up late managing deals that never seemed to end. Behind the fame and fast cars, there was a man who was burning out. His friends and co-workers noticed the change. The once light-hearted energy that filled Gas Monkey Garage began to fade. He was still cracking jokes, one crew member recalled, but you could tell something was off. He wasn't sleeping, he wasn't smiling as much. It was like the joy had been replaced by pressure. Then came the breaking point. The decision that would shock fans worldwide. In 2020, after nearly a decade of Fast and Loud, Richard announced that the show was ending. For him, it wasn't just a business move. It was a desperate need to reclaim control over his life. "I had to stop," he admitted in an emotional interview. "It wasn't fun anymore. I was losing myself in the process." But stepping away from the cameras didn't magically fix everything. The empire he had built required constant attention, and without the show's momentum, new challenges emerged. The garage faced setbacks, employees came and went, and financial pressures grew heavier in a changing automotive market. On top of it all, Richard's personal life continued to unravel. The breakdown of his marriage, the loss of longtime partnerships, and the emotional toll of fame left him feeling isolated, a man surrounded by success but empty inside. Richard spoke candidly about this period, describing it as one of the darkest times of his life. When cameras are on, you're alive. You've got a crew, you've got fans, you've got noise. But when it all goes quiet, that's when you start hearing the things you've been running from. Those things were regret, loneliness, and exhaustion that had been building for years, even the cars, once his greatest passion, started, feeling like reminders of everything he'd lost along the way. He'd walk into the garage, see the gleaming chrome and polished paint, but the excitement was gone. The roar of the engines no longer thrilled him. It echoed like a ghost of what once was. For someone like Richard, whose entire identity was built around speed, slowing down felt unbearable. Yet, in that stillness, he began to face truths he had long ignored, the sacrifices he made for fame. The relationships left in ruins, and the heavy emotional price of success. It was in those quiet, painful months that Richard realized something crucial. Life wasn't just about building cars or chasing attention. It was about finding meaning beyond the machines. But the road to rediscovering that meaning would not be easy, and what came next would push him to the very edge. Once again, after years of living in the fast lane, Richard Rawlings finally found himself standing still, surrounded by the remnants of his empire. His failed relationships, and the lingering question of who he had become. For a man who had always thrived on motion, the silence was deafening. But in that stillness came clarity. The end of Fast and Loud wasn't just the end of a show, it was the end of an era. Richard had spent decades pushing himself harder than anyone else, driven by an unshakable hunger for success. Now, at 55, he was left to face the consequences of a lifetime spent chasing speed, both on the road and in life. "I used to think if I stopped moving, I'd disappear," he admitted in a recent interview. "But maybe slowing down is the only way to survive." In the months following the show's end, Richard began a long, painful process of rebuilding, not his business, but himself. He started traveling again, not for fame or deals, but for peace. Away from the lights and the noise, he reconnected with old friends and rediscovered the quiet joy of working on cars without cameras watching. For the first time in years, he could build something simply because he loved it. Not because it had to make good television, but even as he sought healing, tragedy continued to shadow him. Several close friends from the automotive world passed away, reminding him of the fragility of life. "You spend your whole life thinking you've got time," he said somberly. "Then one day you wake up and you realize the ride doesn't last forever." Those losses deepened his resolve to focus on what truly mattered: health, love, and purpose. Richard also opened up about the personal struggles that fame had intensified: anxiety, guilt, and the relentless feeling that he was never doing enough. "You build this image, this brand, this empire," he said, "but behind it, you're still just a man trying not to fall apart." His honesty struck a chord with fans who admired his vulnerability as much as his cars. Today, Richard Rawlings continues to run Gas Monkey Garage, but with a new outlook. The fire that once drove him to conquer every obstacle now fuels a quieter, more grounded mission to inspire others who've hit their own breaking point. Through interviews, online projects, and public appearances, he speaks about resilience, the dangers of burnout, and the importance of balance. "You don't have to crash to find yourself," he often says. But sometimes it takes wreckage to see the road ahead clearly. The tragedy of Richard Rawlings isn't just about what he lost. It's about the years he spent trying to outrun his pain. Yet, through that heartbreak, he found redemption. He learned that true strength isn't measured by how fast you go or how much you earn, but by the courage to stop, reflect, and rebuild from the ruins. At 55. The scars are still there, reminders of the battles he fought, the mistakes he made, and the price of chasing the American dream. But behind the weathered smile and graying beard is a man who has finally found peace in imperfection. Richard's story is no longer one of tragedy, but of survival, and while the world remembers him as the bold, fast-talking car mogul of Fast and Loud, those who followed his journey know the deeper truth, that the most powerful engine Richard Rawlings ever built wasn't a car at all, but the strength to keep going when everything else had fallen apart.